They are our primary trading partner, the number one consumer of our valuable, albeit controversial, black gold. Is it only logical, then, that we formalize a continental energy strategy with our neighbor to the south? Here to discuss that, in Cambria, California, via Skype, Stephen Hayward. He's professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. In Calgary, Alberta, Kenneth Green. That's him on the left. He's Senior Director of Energy and Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute. And David Collier, president of CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. In the nation's capital, David Sawyer, leader of the Climate Change and Energy Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And with us here in studio, Keith Stewart, Climate and Energy Campaign Coordinator with Greenpeace Canada. And we're happy to welcome, Keith, you back to this studio and our other guests in Points Beyond to our discussion tonight about a potential continental energy strategy for Canada and the United States. And to start our discussion, we thought we'd play some tape from the Premier of Alberta, who was at the Brookings in Washington, D.C. last week to talk about this Canada-U.S. trading partnership. Let's hear this clip and then we'll chat. Roll tape, please.
One of the reasons that we are so fortunate in Alberta to have the energy economy that we do is because of historic partnerships with industry leaders in the United States who've seen the potential of what a North American energy economy could be. It's what has led to our great economic success. We share common values and beliefs that allow us to pull together in the same direction and to ensure that we're building infrastructure that allows us to be sustainable in North America. That is ultimately what Canada-U.S. energy trade is about. That is what our friendship has been about. That is what our whole relationship has been about. And we're striving to overcome some of the same challenges around sustainable growth and development as you are. In Keystone, we have a solution in hand.
Premier Alison Redford at the Brookings Institution last week. She mentioned Canada and the United States. I mentioned Canada and the United States off the top. We don't want to forget about the Mexicans. They may be part of this as well, and we'll get to that later in our discussion. But let's first go around the table, metaphorical as it may be, starting with Stephen Hayward in California, and talk about how dependent you think the U.S.-Canadian energy partnership is. How dependent is it on Keystone XL being approved by the United States?
I don't know. If it's not shipped by the pipeline, it's going to be shipped by rail cars and maybe even by trucks, or Canada will decide to build a pipeline to either one or both of its coasts and sell the oil overseas to the Chinese and other customers. Look, those hydrocarbons are going to come out of the ground. They're going to enter the marketplace somehow. And it seems to me that the United States would be very foolish, both for economics but also diplomatic reasons, if they turn the pipeline down.
Kenneth Green, let me get you to weigh in on that. How much is our relationship with the United States in terms of energy, that partnership, dependent on America greenlighting Keystone?
Well, as Steve said, I think that Keystone is an important element of it. There are other ways to move the oil to market, and the U.S. demand for oil is declining over time. And so the importance of Keystone, in a sense, will reduce over time if alternate means can be found to get Canada's oil to world markets. But in theory, of course, we'd like to be an integrated market with the United States. They're the closest. The transport costs would be the least. The access to refineries would be the nearest and simplest way to go. You'd like to have more integration of market integration rather than less.
David Collier, same question to you.
I think very much the same comment. We've had for a long time a very strong energy trading relationship with the United States. We've got a project in front of us that is the next manifestation of that. I think on its merits, it's very clear it should be approved, and I think it would be a rather disappointing and I think negative, frankly. It would have a negative impact on the Canada-U.S. trading relationship in the event that it were not approved. We are optimistic it will be. Does that mean Canadian oil won't go to market? No. Does it mean that the United States won't continue to consume oil? No. This is about where the U.S. sources its oil. We think it makes all kinds of sense to continue to source oil from Canada. And on that basis, the Keystone project should be approved.
Let's go east. David Sawyer, your view.
Yeah, I agree with the comments. I think you have to think of Canada as an energy warehouse, and it's not just about oil and gas. You know, the Canada-U.S. energy relationship goes back a long way and is, involves a diverse, group of products, energy products. So you think about hydropower. I mean, there are major issues in the U.S., ongoing issues with the U.S. around hydropower and energy exports there. So, yes, Keystone's an important and very, very visible sort of indicator of the state of the relationship. but it goes, so much more beyond just Keystone. And whether project approval happens or not, that long and deep energy relationship will continue.
Keith Stewart.
The basic principle here should be don't make a problem worse. And if we are going to do what scientists say is necessary to avoid dangerous levels of global warming, we need to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure like Keystone and the expansion of the tar sands that it would enable, because the tar sands can't get much bigger without new pipelines. And we need to invest instead in renewable energy alternatives, in energy efficiency. As was noted, demand for oil is dropping in the US, it's dropping in Canada, it's dropping throughout the developed world. We need to start driving that down everywhere. And that means, not spending the more than $150 billion that's sort of estimated to expand the tar sands or been proposed on building infrastructure that's going to be around for 40 or 50 years, and instead invest in different things. So we think turning down Keystone is one decision. It's an important decision, and it's got to be sort of like the next step that we take in that direction, but we need to move our energy strategy towards low carbon, no carbon alternatives, and not into really carbon-intensive fossil fuels.
Keith, one quick follow-up, because my ears pricked up when you said something that nobody else says these days. Everybody else calls it the oil sands. You just called it the tar sands over and over and over. How come?
Tar sands, oil sands, to my mind, if that's the main part of the argument, we're having the wrong discussion. But, it was called the tar sands for a long time until it was rebranded as the oil sands because people thought it sounded better. It's not oil, it's bitumen. We could call it the bitumen sands, but that's a little awkward. But basically, it's not something you drill into the ground and it comes out like conventional oil. You actually have to steam or boil it out of the sand, then upgrade it before it becomes a type of crude oil which can go to a refinery. And there's huge greenhouse gas emissions involved in those steps. And what we're saying is, rather than moving to unconventional fuels as we run out of the sort of the cheap and easy stuff, we need to go in a different direction.
Okay, I got that message. Kenneth, let me follow up with you on this. So far, most of you have been saying the oil is going to find a market. The Americans are going to, I know not you, Keith, but everybody else is saying, the oil is going to find a market. The Americans are going to buy our oil. And yet, everybody is also saying, so if this Keystone doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world. So should we not think that this partnership is at risk if, in fact, Keystone doesn't go ahead?
No, I think it poses a risk. One of the things Steve said earlier on was that there's a diplomatic angle to this, too. Normally, one does not physically blockade one's trading partners' access to markets. That's considered a bit beyond the pale in international relations. And you have to think actually turning down the Keystone pipeline would cause something of an ongoing, rankling sore point between the two governments. And I would just like to comment, the Fraser Institute just did a study on Ontario's Green Energy Act and showed what happens if we follow the path of Greenpeace. Greenpeace would like us to go down renewable energy, wind and solar power instead of traditional fossil fuels. And it's an ugly picture of high energy prices scheduled to go 40 and 50% higher still, and pending loss of manufacturing and mining in the investment in the province, and higher prices for consumers across the board. So we know what that future looks like. It's not a nice one, and I really don't think we're headed that way.
Well, I don't want to get too off topic here, but did your study also look into whether the air's cleaner?
The air was actually getting cleaner for the last 30 years. The trends were set for most of the virtually all of the pollutants in Ontario going back 20 years now. There's still a remaining problem with low-level ozone, which is complicated, but virtually every other air pollution indicator is below the health safety standards set by the Canadian government. Okay,
we're going to have more on that in a bit, actually. But Stephen, let me get you to follow up on the comments just made by Kenneth. Namely, do you think it would be a problem in terms of diplomatic relations between Canada and the United States if there were either a no on Keystone, or if protesters blockaded or something like that?
Oh, I absolutely do. I mean, I have to say I was really fascinated last week when Premier Redford made that speech at the Brookings Institution in a very public way. I'll tell you why. When Ken and I worked together a year or so ago at American Enterprise Institute in Washington, every time we tried to put together a panel on the Keystone Pipeline, we'd call over the Canadian Embassy. And not only did they not want to put anyone on a panel, quite properly so, they didn't want to be mucking around in American domestic politics in an election year, but they were even reluctant to show up and watch the panel. And so this really shows to me an about face. And, Canadians, understandably, with good reason, think, we Americans with sharp elbows, dominate Canadian politics and culture to some extent. And if we turn down the Keystone Pipeline, I certainly couldn't blame any Canadians who said, what is with you Americans? I mean, you'll take our beer and our comedians and actors, but you won't take our oil? What's wrong with our oil?
David, do they only want our comedians and not the rest of it?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know what to say to that. You got me thinking about beer and U.S. beer.
Well, we know ours is better.
Yeah, and it's the question. I mean, why this shift in policy? And it's a good question. We've had an energy policy in Canada for 30 years, which is based on market access and market-driven energy policy, and it served us well. Sort of the government sets the enabling conditions to allow the sector to basically, do what it does best, which is, get stuff out of the ground and then get it to market. And the government sets the rules of the game, including environmental, social, health and safety safeguards. What's happened, though, is, there's been a shift, obviously, in the market, this exclusive market access has left us exposed in a whole series of markets. And again, not just oil and gas, but electricity. There are issues around California's cap and trade program and hydro coming out of BC, and basically tariffs being put on Canadian electricity, or threats of that ilk. So there's sort of a rethink going on that says, okay, we have to come up with a better way of doing business, and we have to push for market access, but we also have to demonstrate that we're getting our environmental house in order, and we're a global leader in environmental performance. So it's these twin objectives of development and environmental performance that are, slowly the policymakers are realizing, oh yeah, we gotta, this matters.
David Collier, let me ask what I hope is a key question around all of this, which is the existing pipeline infrastructure between Canada and the United States not satisfactory to deal with American demands for secure crude oil?
Well, it clearly isn't today, given that we're looking at a number of expansion proposals, Keystone being one of them. So as we grow Canadian production, we do need to grow pipeline infrastructure, not only to the United States, but elsewhere, whether that's Eastern Canada or the West Coast to Asia. So we clearly do need to expand infrastructure. And one of the points I'd like to make, and come back to Keith's point, is that this is always positioned as a binary choice. We can have oil or we can have renewables of one form or another. And I guess the point I would make is that the market has worked very well for us for a long period of time. There's nothing that precludes, other than market circumstances, renewables being developed. We certainly understand that renewables are going to play a larger role in the energy mix. But to suggest that oil and gas are not going to, for a long time, be a major part of our energy supply, I think is patently unreasonable. And let's take advantage of the opportunity we've got to serve a market in the U.S. and to diversify markets beyond that. And I would point out that increased production generates revenue, both royalties and taxes, that can be used to serve a diversity of purposes, and gives us a lot more optionality as a country than we would have otherwise. So I think there's a number of reasons why we ought to expand that infrastructure to the U.S. We need to, but it's not the only market, and we do need to diversify beyond the United States market, again, to Eastern Canada and to Asia.
Let me get Keith to react to that insofar as, while Western Canada has been developing its sources of oil or bitumen, Premier of Ontario, the then Premier, Dalton McGuinty, certainly pursued a green energy policy, which certainly put up a lot more windmills and more solar and all of that. So is David not right that you can take a two-track policy on this?
Well, I think we need to distinguish between the infrastructure that we have that is going to be with us for decades, and the infrastructure that we build next. And so what we're saying is, and we're following actually the International Energy Agency on this. If you read their reports, they say if you want to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, they have 3 scenarios, one with 2 degrees of warming, one with 4 degrees, one with 6 degrees. And they say, currently we're on track for 6 degrees of warming. If the world did all the policies they promised to through the Copenhagen Accord and other climate treaties, they would be at 4, but everyone said we need to stay below 2, including Stephen Harper. So if you want to stay below 2 degrees, you basically can't build new fossil fuel infrastructure. They said 2/3 of the known reserves of fossil fuels need to stay in the ground if we're going to avoid that limit. So what we're saying is, when we talk about building something new, and this is where I think it's a key distinction. We're not saying the existing stuff is going to be gone tomorrow. But when we talk about making new investments, we have to drive those in the low carbon direction. If we are serious about avoiding dangerous levels of global warming and leaving that kind of an inheritance for our kids. Now, with regards to the Green Energy Act, we could go back and forth on that a lot, but I actually think for people in Ontario, it would be, you should go to Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, Gord Miller. He posted a rebuttal to that Fraser Institute study on his website yesterday or the day before. So you don't even have to take sort of Greenpeace's word on it, Greenpeace against the Fraser Institute. Look at what Gord Miller, who is a pretty well-respected guy, and he's been on this show a lot, what he said about that study. And I think it'll be interesting for your viewers.
That's a different rabbit hole to go down for a different program, but I want to get us back here on the issue of this pipeline that everybody is debating and what it portends for a potentially larger energy relationship between Canada and the United States. Beyond Keystone, we also want to get a better understanding on this program of what a continent-wide energy strategy might look like. So, Ken Green, let me start with you on this one. Alberta has, of course, a lot to offer to the United States in terms of the bitumen, but give us a sense of what the energy supply potential is for the United States.
Well, I mean, Canada not only sells, as we mentioned, we not only sell bitumen, we also can export natural gas. We also export electricity in the form of hydro and others. So there's potential to grow Canada's exports considerably. Again, another report we did a month or so ago looked at the question of Canada as an energy super producer or a superpower. And there's clearly room to grow there and profit Canadians if the infrastructure can be built. As was mentioned earlier, it's not just companies that profit. Revenues are generated for government. People get benefits in lower energy rates and lower costs of goods and services. So there's a great deal of potential to be exploited if Canada wants to go that route and takes the steps necessary. One more quick comment, which is that other people have mentioned the markets. I mean, historically, this has been done through market forces. Their governments have set some ground rules, but markets have brought the energy products to people that they want in the form they want it at the price they want it. And that's what's being moved away from with all these discussions of we need national energy strategies, we need national energy plans, we need more centralized planning of green energy transitions in the United States and in provincial levels. That efficient system of allocating resources that we call the market is steadily being encroached upon by government planning. And the question is, in my mind, are we going to move ahead in that direction of central planning of the energy economy, or are we going to stick with what we've had that works pretty well to bring people what they want, which is functioning energy markets that are integrated with transport between the two countries? Well,
let me do a brief follow-up with you. You say the markets work pretty well. Does the markets account for or care whether the planet is destroyed in the process of bringing these products to market?
Well, of course, in the most abstract sense, the answer is yes, because if the world is destroyed, the people who want to sell things aren't going to have anybody to sell anything to. What you're talking about is, are there externalities to markets that have to be internalized or in some way checked by government? And the answer is, generally speaking, yes. I think that's the case with energy. That no, the private sector by itself will not necessarily internalize the full cost of risks, particularly not when they're global, particularly not when they're long-term, and particularly not when they're intergenerational. The question is, how do you estimate what your future risk exposure is, and how do you internalize that efficiently and without distorting markets, and without basically killing the goose that lays the golden eggs for your economy? It's not whether you do it or not, or whether the threat is real. It's more a matter of the esoterics of how severe is it likely to be, how much is it likely to cost, what if you were to levy a tax, how would you levy the tax to match the cost of what you're expecting in future generations? That's a big, big topic. We can do many shows on that.
Okay. Well, before we do that show, let's finish up this one first. And to that end, I want to go to Stephen Hayward now. We mentioned off the top that, of course, talking continental energy policy, we're talking mostly Canada and the United States, but we don't want to forget Mexico. And I wonder, Mexico obviously is a big energy player on this continent, and I wonder whether there is much potential for the Canadian system to be dealing with Mexico in this equation.
I think the answer is yes, but if I just spend a second to clear up a confusion that always comes up in these discussions and has come up again here. Both Keith and one of the Davids have talked about oil and renewables, either oil versus renewables or oil and renewables. Remember something, that renewable energy, especially wind and solar, are not substitutes for oil. They generate electricity. We use oil for liquid fuels for transportation. We don't have the technology yet for cars and trucks and planes and trains to run on solar power. So you're going to need oil to run those until we come up with something that can work at the same kind of scale, and ethanol ain't it. In fact, I think most environmentalists now agree that ethanol is environmentally inferior. So if the United States doesn't get its oil from Canada or from Mexico, we're going to import it by tanker from all the other places around the world, from Africa, from the Middle East, and so forth. Now, I actually think there's huge potential to bring Mexico into this conversation, because Mexico has this state-owned oil company that just performs, I forgot the name of it. It performs miserably, and their production's been declining when it ought to be increasing. And if you bring them into a North American consortium for energy and start thinking about perhaps more pipelines to Mexico too, I think you'd actually rejuvenate the Mexican energy producing sector as well. And then North America becomes this energy colossus that was talked about in the last couple of years. It reminds me, I'll finish with this, it reminds me of when that former Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan in the 1970s said, we ought to have a free trade zone for North America, which became NAFTA. And I think now we ought to talk about something like a free energy zone for North America that links in all three countries together.
Free energy zone for North America. So you want a FESNA?
Well, I don't know what the acronym is, but
I just gave it to you. Okay. David Collier, could you maybe put a little more flesh on that bone? If we do get into some kind of tripartite, Canada, United States, Mexico, energy colossus, as Stephen just described it, what does that actually look like?
Well, I think we've got the opportunity in front of us if we look at North America. If you back up 5 or 10 years and put in front of anyone in the energy field the potential for North America to be energy self-sufficient in 2015, 2020, 2030, I think most people would have said that's a quite unrealistic assumption. We have that opportunity in front of us. What does it mean? I think some rather profound geopolitical implications, some significant balance of trade, positive balance of trade implications. You could see Canada and certainly the U.S. becoming net exporters of energy. In the case of Canada, net exporter. In the case of U.S., net exporter. Some significant employment and economic benefits. Some very, I think, significant positive impacts again on the competitiveness of fuel supply in North America, which benefits industries across the board. So I think if you start to look at what are the implications of, what are the potential benefits of a North America that's stitched together in a manner that drives energy self-sufficiency, some very, very significant positive benefits, and that's the opportunity in front of us. And that's frankly what we should be working together to try and realize. And that will create economic benefit, it will create security of supply benefit, I think it will create some environmental benefit that will allow us flexibility and opportunity to do things that are not otherwise there. And that's the prize, in my view.
Let me put that to Keith Stewart. Keith, I know you are not a fan of fossil fuels, obviously. However, put a geopolitical hat on for a second. Would you not prefer to live in a world where Iraq or Iran or Libya or Saudi Arabia didn't have the kind of hold that it currently has on the North American economy because we wouldn't need their energy anymore? We could do it ourselves.
Well, I think when we're talking about a national or a continental energy strategy, and I've been involved in these national energy strategies discussions for a couple of years now, the key question is a strategy to do what?
Serve ourselves. Let's start there.
So is it to serve my thing would be, is it to serve ourselves with all the oil and gas we currently consume? Or is it to make that transition in the energy economy towards a greener alternatives? And primarily, for oil, the first thing is to actually use less. We could cut oil consumption in half with more efficient vehicles, better public transit, as we also start moving towards electrification of transportation over the coming decades. And there you'll get sort of the wind and the solar providing that. That's the kind of thing that we need to cooperate around. We need to set clear targets for this is where we're going. You need to know where you're going before you develop a strategy to get there. And I think we want energy self-sufficiency of a certain type of energy in a way that lives within the boundaries of our carbon budget. And I think anyone who says, we've got to just set that aside for the moment is really doing a disservice to our kids, to their kids, and to sort of what are the sort of the important things we're going to be remembered for? Are we going to be good ancestors?
I hear you, but I'm not sure you're being responsive to my question, which is, would you not love to be able to just thumb your nose at all of these Middle Eastern countries who are not democratic, quite frankly, and be much less dependent on their participation in the energy sector today?
Well, the best way to do that is to reduce the demand for the product, because it goes to the lowest, unless the oil companies are willing to start buying from higher cost producers. Right now, the highest cost production in the world is pretty much in Alberta, whereas the regimes you're talking about are primarily low cost. So as demand drops, if prices, if we can drive demand down, prices start dropping, the first thing that's going to be canceled is not going to be over there unless we actually have major government intervention. About 85% of the oil projects that were canceled or pushed back in the world in response to the 2008 recession were in the tar sands because they're the high-cost producer.
Okay,
so that's the result the market delivers.
David Sawyer, can I get you on this issue of whether a Canada, United States, Mexico, continental free trade energy zone, whatever you want to call it, whether you like the geopolitical implications of that?
You have to think of two ideas. One idea, so you have to think of what is an energy strategy. No one currently involved at the highest levels of provincial governments anyway, and I think the federal government, is thinking that it's a massive new social planning endeavor to plan out how we're going to develop oil sands and how we're going to develop, other energy resources in Canada. The energy discussion, under an umbrella of an energy framework is really about creating space to debate important long-term ideas between jurisdictions. So that leads to the next important point, which is, well, if we can in Canada get our own collective house in order, with the federal government and the federation, coming around common issues that need to be discussed around a whole range of really, really critical long-term energy and environmental issues. If we can't get our own house in order, how are we going to create space for the U.S. to be involved and Mexico to be involved? Now, if the Americans came to us and said we want to do this, I think we'd jump pretty quick and sign up to smooth the waters and sort of make projects like the Keystone a little more easy to implement. But really, when you think about it, it speaks to a need for a dialogue, and a need for a dialogue primarily around market access, but also around sort of this transition to a low carbon or a clean energy future.
Stephen, let me get you to comment on something that Mitt Romney talked about during the latter stages of the 2012 American presidential race. I believe he was in New Mexico when he talked about a Canada-U.S.-Mexican partnership as it related to energy. And Canada's own David Frum, the former speechwriter in the Bush White House, wrote back in August of last year the following with regard to that. He wrote, "In the past, American talk of continental energy strategies provoked furious reactions in Canada. The prospect of continental energy sharing was a major argument against the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement back in the 1980s. And now the issue is being raised again, and the reaction from Canada is quiet. I see two reasons," Frum says, "for this change of view among Canadians. The first is a great sustained rise in national self-confidence. The second, and maybe more important reason, is that the rising importance of the oil sands has altered the way many Canadians think about resources." Let's go around on this one. Stephen Hayward, what do you think about those comments?
I think they're both right on. I mean, David's a friend who I don't always agree with, needless to say, but I think he nailed both of those quite right. I think that, let's set that back a minute. What's going on right now worldwide is a hydrocarbon renaissance. And this is, I think, unfortunate for Keith, is environmentalists are being run over right now by the hydrocarbon renaissance that's going on everywhere, and it's changing everybody's outlook. I mean, look, the United States is now projected to be the world's leading oil producer, and nobody foresaw that 3-4 years ago. In fact, I've been saying for a long time that if anybody in Washington had gotten wind that this was happening, they surely would have done something to stop it. But here it is, along with the natural gas boom, spreading to Europe, spreading to Asia, and so we got to figure out how to deal with it.
Keith, we got more self-confidence, and the rising importance of the oil sands has made Canadians think differently about that resource. That's what Frum says. What do you say?
Yeah, there's actually a climate scientist, David Keith, who actually splits his time between Harvard and Calgary. And he talks a lot about what he calls dangerous abundance. The fact that we have so many fossil fuels, they are so useful, they are wonderful products in making people's lives easier, except there's this catch. We're now realizing that if we start trying to burn all of these or even a small portion of them, we're going to make this planet really uncomfortable for most species, probably including our own. And I think what we actually have to do is, this is a very difficult thing to sort of say like, oh, here's something that we can get get rich really quickly, and everyone else is doing it, so let's do it too. And we actually have to have the courage to say, no, we're going to do something else. We're going to take that longer view, and we're going to say we actually have to make that shift. And we're having You can't turn on a hockey game or the TV without seeing ads about how great the oil sands are and how wonderful they are. And so, this isn't something which just came out of nowhere. It's been millions upon millions of dollars being spent to create that impression. And I think what we have to do is sort of speak to people's better selves. And in politics, that's usually not a winning strategy, but it's necessary.
Let's see what you think of these figures. I want to bring a new chart into the discussion here because gradually, over the past few years, Canada's Prime Minister and America's President have indicated that Canada will probably be trying to harmonize our climate change targets with the American targets. And we want to bring a map up here that shows the total CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, from the consumption of energy in 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and China. And look at these numbers. Look at the bottom of the graph. There's Canada, which is that's a pretty straight line. But as you can see, towards 210, the line is actually ever so gently coming down, which is a good sign. If you go up to the next line, the Chinese line is just going, it's a hockey stick. It's going off the charts right now, which is not good. And then the United States, again, ever so gradually up and then ever so gradually down as we come towards present day. Now, I guess I want to get some feedback from all of you on this. Do continental, or for that matter, global climate change targets make practical sense given what the 3 different countries are doing here so far? David Collier, you want to start us off on that?
Well, we've certainly, it's very clear we've harmonized with the U.S. We've been very clear all along that the challenge for Canada, given our resource-based economy and the fact that we're a significant energy exporter, is greater than that of the U.S. in meeting those targets. Nevertheless, we are signed up for the Copenhagen targets. I think that conversation needs to focus on what do we need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deliver over time that transition to a lower carbon economy. We're not going to do it if we don't have a healthy economy. Point number 1 I would make. Second, it is going to take time. I think we need to focus not only on lower carbon energy sources, renewables of one form or another, and that's an important part of it. We need to focus on reducing the carbon intensity of the energy we produce today. And that's what our energy industry, oil and gas, is focused on. Investment in technology, how do we drive down those emissions over time? And that is going to take time. Second, the other important point, I think, is that this has got to be an economy-wide look. And I think one of the things that is grossly unfair is to load the burden of carbon policy, whether it be in the U.S. or Canada, on any one particular project or any one source of carbon. We've got a job to do to be part of the solution in the oil and gas industry, but I think it's got to be much more broadly based, and we've got to think about how we maintain a healthy economy while we also reduce the carbon intensity of our economy. And also, back to the point that was made earlier, to what extent are we going to rely on market forces to do that, which generally have been fairly successful, and to what extent are we going to rely on government intervention? And I would highlight the fact that government intervention actually requires a source of funds from somewhere to try and influence what that energy mix looks like.
Well, David Sawyer, let me get you to follow up with this. We saw what government intervention looked like last week when the Alberta government, the energy minister in Alberta, brought in some fairly wide-ranging and far-reaching proposals, taxing carbon, that kind of thing. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, so just to be clear, there are proposals perhaps on the table. It's unclear what actually is happening in terms of the negotiations around new federal and provincial oil and gas regulations to control GHGs. So there is ongoing effort. The effort is circling around basically increasing the effort of Alberta's current plan, which is basically requiring oil sands producers and conventional oil producers to reduce emissions. So they're facing a price on carbon right now. So the proposals on the table are really about sort of increasing the stringency or effort required. It's part of an ongoing process of the federal government over the last 2 years to slowly go through Canada's emission inventory and start requiring large industrial emitters to basically reduce emissions. And just to pick up on one previous point, oil is so embedded in everything we do, everything we touch. It's so pervasive that, putting the burden on any one single country or sector, and while pointing to another country and saying, well, they're not doing anything in China, oh, those dirty Chinese, look at them, look at their growth. It's not a helpful debate. I mean, most of the emissions in a barrel of oil sit in end use, which is our cars. and yet I can drive around and I see no price on my emissions except in British Columbia where they have a carbon tax. So, yes, oil sands, needs stronger policy. Yes, we need to sort of align policy with what the science is telling us, but we also need to broaden sort of the scope of this, the effort and really address a pretty deep-seated and complex problem.
Ken Green, let me get your take on what the Alberta Energy Minister has proposed so far, which many in industry found potentially objectionable.
Right. Well, two quick points. You actually do pay a tax on your greenhouse gas emissions in the sense that you pay more for your cars that are more fuel efficient because regulations require them to be. So it's not quite true that you're not paying them already. You're also paying carbon taxes in the form of many other pollution regulations, which add to the cost of your appliances and your home insulation and everything else. Those are also proxy carbon taxes in a sense. My understanding is what's proposed or was discussed here is raising Alberta's carbon levy, which is an odd sort of combination of a tax and a trading system, from the current requirement, which is of a 12% improvement in emissions intensity, and you pay $15 a ton if you can't make that target now. They want to make that 40 and 40% reductions in improvement in emission intensity, and a $40 tax if you can't pay it. Now you can either pay the tax to the province, you can trade with other producers for credits, which is why it's a weird hybrid program. But either way, they're backpedaling from that position even as we speak. And from my understanding, the Premier has said she's not endorsing any number or target, and is not siding with the Environment Minister.
Keith, did you like the 40-40 program, or would you like you would have liked even more probably?
Well, actually, to bring it back to the first question, I mean, it's interesting because it was very clear when Alberta made this proposal that the reason that this is even being discussed, and 40-40 is the high proposal, there's a lower proposal as well, there's several on the table, is because they think that they need it to get their pipelines approved. They need to show that they're taking some kind of action.
They need to demonstrate that they're environmentally sensible.
And the analysis that came out of the Pembina Institute on this said that you would actually need to have a price more between $100 and $150 per ton in this type of that sort of hybrid system, which was well described there, to actually drive significant reductions, the kind of reductions needed for Canada to meet its overall target. To come back to something Dave Collier said, the reason we talk a lot about the tar sands in climate policy is because Environment Canada is projecting those emissions to more than double by 2020. So they're rising. So they're the fastest rising source of greenhouse gas emissions. They have been for a long time. And that increase is projected to be larger than all of the other measures we're taking to decrease elsewhere in the economy.
Just want to understand this. You're saying developing the oil sands will result in a doubling of greenhouse gas emissions? From the oil sands. So their own emissions are projected to go up to over 100 million tons per year. I see.
So that the increase there is greater than all the reductions happening for things like Ontario phasing out coal, where coal-fired electricity, which used to be one of the backbones of the Ontario system, coal produced less electricity than wind power last year in Ontario. I mean, that's a sign, I think, of some real success. We have obviously a lot further to go. But for things like the 40-40 proposal, they're only there because there is this kind of tough pressure for forcing action, people jumping up and down and shouting a bit, and blocking projects, or the possibility of them being blocked in BC, in the US. But we actually need to go much further than this if we're going to achieve Canada's own targets. Now, Greenpeace would like to do much more than that, but the Auditor General federally has said, his office has said, we're not on track. It's Environment Canada has said we're only on track to achieve half of the reductions we need for Canada to achieve the target that Stephen Harper established. So we got to do more somewhere. And it seems to me the place you start is where the things are actually going up the fastest.
So let me ask Stephen Hayward his view. The Alberta proposals that came out, admittedly quite controversial. What did you think of them?
I'm not very well versed in the Alberta proposals, I have to say. I'm a parochial American, unfortunately. I'll just say that sort of your original question that began this latest round robin was on sort of harmonizing U.S. and Canadian emissions targets. We can harmonize targets all day long. I'm very jaundiced, very skeptical about this whole, that anything's actually going to happen in a practical way. I mean, look, I think the whole Kyoto process has been the climate diplomacy equivalent of the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s. It was going to eliminate war. We saw how well that worked out. I think this is one of the great failures of international diplomacy. And so, I mean, what America and Canada get together and say we're going to do is really kind of a sideshow in the grand scheme of things. I'm sorry to be that blunt, but that's what we Americans are like.
Well, let me do this follow-up. Are there any regulations that you could see that you think would be useful that a continental energy strategy could include that would allow the development of the oil sands while at the same time trying to keep our greenhouse gas emissions in check?
Complicated question. The brief summary answer would be, I think there is room for some creative thinking about carbon intensity targets, which I think one of the Davids mentioned a moment ago. It's not clear to me that a lot of our interventions in the last 30 years have actually changed the trajectory of decarbonization of the energy sector that much. It's not clear. It's a really, as I say, complicated question. But I think that there is room for some performance standards ideas, and I think I'll just stop right there.
Okay, David Collier, could you pick up on that? Any potential regulations you can see that would allow you to do what you want to do, while at the same time satisfying better, perhaps, the interests of a guy like Keith Stewart?
Well, a couple of comments I would make. First of all, just to put oil sands greenhouse gas emissions in context, there's no question that they're increasing in absolute terms because production's increasing. They're currently 6% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. So, we have a choice to make. There's a lot of room between 6 and 100 in terms of looking at other segments of the economy. And that's not to absolve the oil and gas sector of the responsibility to do what it needs to do. But there's a lot of room in there to look across the economy, whether that's efficiencies in construction, in buildings, the way we use energy, because that's where the majority of the emissions are. I think the real prize in this, in terms of regulation and policy design, is encouraging investment in technology, because that is what at the end of the day is going to really make a difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions on the ground. We talk about a lot of different variants of trading systems and carbon tax and regulatory frameworks, but at the end of the day, the objective is to reduce emissions. And that's going to come through the innovative application of technology. And our view is that we got to think about competitiveness when we develop carbon policy, but we also need to think about how we drive and encourage investment in technology. That's not just through the carbon charge, it's what we do with the funds that are generated through these various regulatory frameworks, and drive that back into technology that's going to make a difference on the ground.
David Sawyer, let me put another option on the table. We started our conversation talking about Keystone, but we've heard a lot of talk as well about another potential avenue for that oil to take, and that is, never mind going south, go east. Run a pipeline to Montreal, and then take it by tanker down to Panama, and that way you avoid all of the controversy around Keystone. Do you think that's a potential option?
Yeah, I want to address the last question quickly and then jump to this one, if I may.
Quickly, please, running out of time.
Quickly, I think the federal government, the province, and industry need to shake hands on this 40-40 proposal and get on with it. It's a good proposal. It sort of balances emission reductions and competitiveness concern. It doesn't go far enough or weak enough for the sort of industry and the NGOs, but at the same time, get on with it. So, shake hands and move on, because we've been dragging for way too long. And oil finds its way to markets. We're shipping a lot of oil to New Brunswick from Alberta. Train loads of oil to New Brunswick to be refined by the Irving refinery there. So there's innumerable ways to get it to market, and it will happen. So, Keystone's important and it's on the table, but there's a whole bunch of proposals. Minister Oliver's number this summer he's talking about is 600 extractive projects, so sort of natural resource projects, at a total value of $650 billion in the next 10 years. So that's what's on the table. So, it's going to happen and it's going to move. It's just a question of how.
Stephen Hayward, if Keystone or the other one, the Northern Gateway pipeline through British Columbia, proved too politically difficult to sell, do you think bringing the oil to Eastern Canada and then taking it down through the Panama Canal and then off to Asia, other markets as well, has that got potential?
Probably. I mean, as I repair to my original proposition, which is that oil is going to find its way to markets somehow. And the only question is are we, for political reasons, going to do it in an inefficient and more costly way, which would be tankers, which would be higher emissions probably than running it through a pipeline, in fact, certainly would, or are we going to do it in a sensible way with a pipeline? And the only other question is how quickly we're going to use up these resources. I mean, I can go halfway with Keith and say we want to lower the intensity with which we use oil. That just means we're going to use that resource over a longer time period.
David Collier, what about going east instead of going south or west?
Well, I think it's all of the above, frankly. The Eastern Canadian option's gaining momentum. I think it makes a lot of sense to move Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canada, not only to supply Eastern Canadians and displace imports in Eastern Canada, but potentially get to tidewater and export from Eastern Canada to a diversity of markets. The reality, I think, is we are going to increase pipeline capacity to the U.S. in one form or another. I think it'll be Keystone, maybe it'll be something else. The Eastern Canadian option, I think, is gaining momentum, likely to happen. And I do think we'll end up exporting oil from the west coast of Canada. And given the potential production growth, given the market demand, I think we're going to need all of the above, and I think all of them will happen in time.
Keith, if you go east instead of south or west, you avoid some First Nations issues. You avoid the problems that environmentalists see with creating these new pipelines. Does the eastern option look a little better from where you're sitting? I know, don't tell me the same old thing that I know it's still fossil fuel at the end of the day.
So I think the eastern pipelines are going to face the same kind of opposition that other pipeline proposals have. Because I think they're the choke point right now for expanding the tar sands. And they tried to go south, didn't work, tried to go west, it's not going to work either. Now they're talking about moving it east, and everyone's saying, oh, this will be easy, but it's going to face the same types of obstacles. It's going to face opposition here too, because this is a place we can actually have a discussion about do or do not in a way that you can't about 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, very abstract things. It's like, are we going to do this project or not? And so right now, we're sort of starting to rally opposition to those projects, talking to people about why it's a bad idea. Fertile ground in Quebec, to be honest. It's pretty hard to get east without going through Quebec. So the Quebec is saying they're going to do their own environmental assessment of Enbridge's Line 9 proposal. They'll probably say the same thing about TransCanada when they finally come forward with a proposal.
So it doesn't look any easier as far as you're concerned.
So no, it's at a later. It's sort of just starting now, but it's going to run into the same types of concerns.
Okay, let me put a new issue on the table here for Ken.
One quick comment. Sorry to interject.
Sorry, who's that,
I
David?
just want to make the point. There's no question. I wouldn't for a minute argue that there isn't opposition to these projects. There clearly is. But I think it's really important to be clear that that's not broad public opposition. When we look at the Canadian public and frankly the American public, there is very broad support for oil and gas development in Canada and the increased sale of Canadian product to the United States. So there's clearly opposition, no question about that. But let's not leave the impression that the public broadly is strongly opposed to oil and gas development, because that's clearly not the case.
You think it's all left-wing environmental groups?
It all depends on how you ask the question in the poll. I can get a poll that'll tell you the opposite. You have to look at the way the question is phrased, what the preamble is, and you'll get very different results. It's should Canada, comply with its climate commitments even if it requires limiting expansion of oil and gas? And the answer you'll get a very different answer.
You get a yes on that?
We can get sort of strong support for climate action, and sort of if you phrase it that way, then people are like, oh yeah, no, we have to sort of make that choice. It all depends on how you ask the question for these types of polls.
If you ask the question, are you prepared to throw, billions of dollars in tax revenues and jobs down the drain in order to satisfy a few lefty environmentalists, you get a different answer, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. Let's, with only a little more than 5 minutes to go here, I want to try and put another couple of issues on the table. And Ken Green, let me start with you on this one. Canada, of course, over the last several decades has been trying to diversify its exports. Let me put it another way. It's been trying not to be overly dependent on the American market. They've been trying to exploit some Asian markets as well. Do you think that affects our energy relationship with the United States every time somebody in Canada says, well, if we can't get the oil south, then we're going to look to the Far East?
I don't think it affects it significantly. I mean, it could be a self-defeating thing to go around saying, in the sense that if the United States really believes that, well, it's not going to matter about Keystone, it reduces the odds that they'll green light Keystone. But I don't really think that discussion affects the dynamic. I mean, let's be serious. Most Americans would have a difficulty pointing out Alberta on a map. And so it's not top of mind for Americans to think, oh, well, those Canadians are diversifying their exports because maybe they don't love us or trust us as much anymore. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it's a smart strategy to have, though, especially since the one giant trading partner is now proving to be a bit of a fickle dance partner with regard to a key Canadian export, that being oil. And so diversification makes sense to me. It's also a legitimate function of government to find ways to new markets for trade and to expand trade relationships. So I think it's generally a good policy.
Stephen Hayward, 36 million Californians. How many of them can find Alberta on a map?
Well, I know I can. I can't speak for the rest of the state.
Okay, good enough. But on the bigger question of whether or not too much Canadian talk about finding markets in Asia is ticking off too many Americans, do you think that's the case?
No, I think most Americans would find that pretty sensible. And I have to say, and to pick up on something Keith said, you know, as an academic political scientist who spends a lot of time with polls, you can fight a lot about the methodology of polls. So I'll just say this. There are few people in America who are more tuned to public opinion than United States senators and House members. And there are solid majorities in both houses, including many Democrats who are solidly in favor of building the Keystone Pipeline. That's the poll that counts.
Okay, David Sawyer, let me try this with you. If, in fact, Canada, as it is trying to exploit trading relationships with the Far East, perhaps in order not to be overly dependent on the United States, is this whole continental energy strategy that we've been talking about for the last hour as relevant or important as perhaps it might once have been?
Well, I think it remains very relevant. You know, we've said consistently that we want to diversify markets. To the point that was made a moment ago, I think Americans understand that. Most people selling any product or commodity would understand that. But that's not to say that the United States does not remain a very important trading partner, energy trading partner, and a broader trading partner for Canada. I think both are important. I come back to the point I made earlier. The opportunity in front of us is for North America to be energy self-sufficient and bring with that all of the benefits that I think that follow. We can have that, and we can also have diversification of markets, be that to Eastern Canada or to Asia. And I think that's what we ought to be striving to achieve.
David Sawyer, what's your view on that?
To North America in doing that.
David Sawyer?
Yeah, from portfolio management, you don't, if you bought all Nortel in your portfolio, you're crazy, right? So you have to think in those terms. It's a question: can we do it in a balanced sort of way? Can we keep the safeguards in place? Do we have the oil spill response mechanisms in place? The perception is we've been dismantling a lot of our environmental safeguards. Real or not, that's a perception, and perception matters. So as we go forward and punch pipelines to the coast and start driving tankers through pretty pristine wilderness, we got to make sure we have our our act together when it comes to environmental safeguards. And we really, in that case, need to be world-leading producers, but also world-leading responders and world-leading risk managers.
David Sawyer, a quick follow-up. We've been talking about aligning our oil interests, but do you think Canada and the United States and Mexico ought to be aligning their energy interests as it relates to, say, shale production or renewables as well?
Yes and no. I mean, the markets are complex. The shale market in the U.S. is a really interesting development, and as that takes off and our conventional fields fall, we could be seeing imports of natural gas, significantly more imports of natural gas into Canada in time. So it's this sort of two-way energy relationship I talked about earlier. And I don't know if we could align our interests. There's a lot going on.
Keith Stewart, last 30 seconds here. Do you think, let's just take the renewable angle of it, which obviously is the one you care about the most. A Canada, U.S., Mexico renewable energy alliance? Does that make any sense?
That would be a wonderful thing. The thing here is when we talk about aligning interests, however, there's there's competing interests in each country. So it's not like Canada has an interest. We have a variety of different interests, but I think if we were to align along that renewables and speeding up that transition, it would be a wonderful thing.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for participating in our program, starting with, in California, from Pepperdine University, Stephen Hayward. We thank you for joining us on the line, or rather via Skype, from Cambria, California. And in Calgary, Alberta, Kenneth Green, the Senior Director of Energy and Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute, and David Collier, the President of CAP. And in the nation's capital, the VP of Climate Energy Partnerships for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, David Sawyer. And here in our Toronto studios, the Climate and Energy Campaign Coordinator for Greenpeace Canada, Keith Stewart. Good of all of you to join us today on TVO.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.